Bonjour et bienvenue à tous. My name is Mary Ellen Kennellan, and I am the Executive Director of the Alliance Française in Chicago. Yes, a bit chilly here, but no snow yet. It is my pleasure to welcome you to our much anticipated new series, The Making of the Great Museums of Paris, curated by Russell Kelley. You might have been with us when we visited the Grand Château, the French Gardens, or the great the great churches of Paris. Today, Russell returns to offer an enthralling new series about an essential pillar of France's cultural heritage, the extraordinary museums that were established in Paris during the Revolution and continuing through the end of the 19th century. We know you'll love it. In this first program, our curator extraordinaire will offer an introduction to his subject. Other talks will feature directors or curators from storied Paris museums. But before we get started, please know that we are using a Zoom webinar format. So this means you only see the guest speakers. No worries. You can use the chat line to communicate with other participants. Give it a try and tell us where you're listening from. We also ask you to use the Q&A icon at the bottom of the screen to ask questions. They will be answered by our guest at the end of the talk. Please also note that we will be sending you a recording in a few days after each talk in the series. This program is presented in partnership with the Alliance Française de Chicago, the Alliance Française Miami Metro, and with communication support from American Friends of le Louvre, American Friends of Versailles, Friends of the Domaine de Chantilly, the French Heritage Society, and the Fédération des Alliances Françaises of the US. It's thanks to supporters like you that we are able to offer quality programming such as the making of the Great Museums of Paris to so many. Our Entrée Libre initiative, for example, makes it possible for students to attend this program free of charge. Supporting us is easy. Take a French class, become a member, make a donation. Honestly, every little bit counts for nonprofit organizations like ours. And now, a few words about Russell. Russell is the curator and moderator of the last 3 winter lecture series on the Grand Château of the Loire and Île-de-France, the making of French gardens, the great churches of Paris. He's lived in Paris for 30 years and is the author of The Making of Paris, the story of how Paris evolved from a fishing village into the world's most beautiful city. He is an authority. So now to you, Russell. À vous.
Merci, Mary-Hélène, and greetings to everyone from balmy Palm Beach, and I'm welcome to the 4th in our series of lectures about French heritage and history. This year, we will be focusing, as Mary-Hélène said, on the great museums of Paris. And one of the things that we do when we visit cities, first things we do is to go visit the museums, and certainly Paris is no exception to that rule. And when we visit the museums, we typically see the temporary exhibitions, the special exhibitions, sometimes the permanent collections. But what we don't really understand is the history behind the museums themselves. And that is the mission of this series. It's to tell the stories of the museums, giving the historical context in which they were created and how they have evolved over their long histories. And in this case, we'll be focusing on the first golden age of museum creation in Paris, which started with the Revolution, and it goes right through the 19th century. And today I will try to set the stage for the coming presentations by 6 museums directors and curators, 6 of the most iconic museums, directors and curators. And I give you fair warning that there will be a lot of slides coming up with a lot of information on them. As Mary-Hélène mentioned, you will be receiving a recording of this lecture, so you can go back and pause on any slide that you would like to revisit if I don't address it fully. So without further ado, most visited museums in Europe in 2019, the first year last year before the pandemic. The Louvre tops the ranking, and the Musée d'Orsay is the number 10, Centre Pompidou 11, Cité des Sciences number 16. Interestingly, given that list, from that list, London has 6 of the top 20, Paris 4, Madrid, Amsterdam 2, Rome, St. Petersburg, Moscow, Florence, Edinburgh 1. But don't overlook Berlin, which has a magnificent museum island with 5 museums on it, all by itself. London leads the ranking with 5 of the top 10 museums in 2019. Paris had 2. But Paris has a lot of museums, and France has even more. 1,220 Musées de France, and Paris has 136 museums made up of national museums, city museums, and private museums. There are 18 national museums in and around Paris. We will talk about the Louvre, the Cluny Museum of the Middle Ages, and Versailles among the national museums. And there are 14 city museums in Paris, and we will talk about the Carnavalet Museum of the History of Paris. There are many other art museums, but museums, of course, cover lots of subjects. There are museums devoted to individuals, writers, painters, sculptors, singers, and eclectic museums in Paris. I particularly like the museums with the relief maps used in the 17th century by the Louis XIV's troops. The Museum of the Mint is quite cool. A very eclectic museum, such as the Museum of the Sewers. And the most visited museums in Paris, however, will not surprise you. The Louvre by far, followed closely by the Musée d'Orsay and Pompidou. We will be focusing in this series, however, on the museums, not of the 20th century, most of which figured on the previous slide, but of the 19th century, actually starting with the Revolution. And we will address them in nearly chronological order, going from the first museum created in France and Paris, the Louvre, in 1793. And the last one to be covered will be the Musée Condé in the Château de Chantilly, which was established in 1898. Because of scheduling issues, however, it will be the second to last talk. So what is a museum? An institution that collects, conserves, and studies objects of historical, scientific, or artistic interest and makes them available for viewing by the public. Comes from the ancient Greek museon, seat of the muses. The Latinized version is museum. But the modern museum was a product of the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. The Renaissance and the Enlightenment were preceded by the Middle Ages, during which religion and faith were the foundation of society, and most art was religious art. And it's pretty clear to me that the first museums in Europe were the churches in Europe, with such masterpieces as the altar piece here. And I'll show you several items, all of which are on display at the Cluny Museum in Paris. The statue of Adam, the Pietà from the French city of Tarascon. And apart from items that are at the Cluny, religious art from the Middle Ages, you've got the spectacular mosaics that were in churches, Romanesque churches, succeeded by the even more spectacular stained glass windows of Gothic architecture, particularly in Chartres and the Sainte-Chapelle. But the Middle Ages did come to an end and were followed by the Renaissance. What events led to the Renaissance? The invention of the printing press, the fall of Constantinople, which brought the Greek philosophers from Constantinople back to Italy and later to Northern Europe, bringing a revival of classical Greek philosophy. The discovery of the New World when Columbus arrived in 1492, beginning the Age of Discovery. Luther's nailing the his 95 Theses to the church doors of Wittenberg, starting the Protestant Revolution and the Scientific Revolution. All of these events led to a new age of humanism with its emphasis on the individual. That age is known as the Renaissance or rebirth, the French word for rebirth, which really started in the two now Italian cities of Florence and Rome. Florence is really the birthplace of the Renaissance, thanks to, in large part, the support of the Medici family. Cosimo funded the construction of the magnificent Duomo, and his grandson, Lorenzo de' Medici, was a great patron of the arts, making Florence the epicenter of the Italian Renaissance. One of the artists patronized by Lorenzo was Botticelli, who produced the spectacular Birth of Venice in 1485. After the Avignon papacy, when the popes were in Rome for 70 years, were in Avignon for 70 years, Pope Gregory XI returned to Rome and started to collect art at the Vatican in an effort to recreate the city's former glory as the ancient capital of the ancient world. One of the items that was on display by the Pope Sixtus IV was the she-wolf suckling Romulus and Remus. The she-wolf itself dates back to the 5th century BC. Romulus and Remus were added, interestingly enough, in the 15th century. And Laocoon and his sons were discovered in Rome in 1506 and were purchased by Pope Julius and put on display in the Vatican in 1506. And the Vatican therefore uses that as a claim to be the first museum. Apart from Florence and the Vatican, as a product of the middle of the age of discovery and the scientific revolution, a number of individuals and monarchs created cabinets of curiosity, as they were known in English, with treasures from nature and the New World. One of the first was Ole Worm's Cabinet of Curiosities in Copenhagen, which is filled mostly with natural specimens. And August the Strong of Poland and Saxony, who had his castle in Dresden, now in Germany, created the magnificent Grünes Gewölbe, the Green Vault, which is filled mostly with art objects and can be visited today. In England, John Tradescant kept his collection in his house in Lambeth, south of London, called the Ark, which consisted of both naturalia, wonders of nature, and artificialia, works of man. Nearby, Hans Sloane, physician and scientist, started his collection, and which he kept in Chelsea in London, also principally including natural specimens, but also artificial curiosities. Everything changed with the arrival of the Enlightenment, also in French known as Les Lumières, which coincides with also known as the Age of Reason, the start of which is often attributed to Descartes and his treatise Discourse on the Method, Cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am, where reason and science replaced faith and religion. And this age produced the first museums. First museums in Europe did not start in Paris. They were elsewhere, in England and Italy. So John Tradescant's son bequeathed his father's collection to one Elias Ashmole in 1677, who donated the collection to Oxford University, which built the Ashmolean Museum, which opened to the public in 1683 and justly claims to be the first public museum. It was replaced by the current Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, built in the 19th century. The British Museum was created when Sir Hans Sloane bequeathed his vast collection to the British nation, and the museum was established in 1753. In Montague House in Bloomsbury in London, and it opened to the public in 1759. The current neoclassical building also dates back to the 19th century and was updated magnificently with the glass roof designed by Sir Norman Foster in 2000. In Italy, the Capitoline Museums opened in 1734 on the Capitoline Hill, one of the 7 hills of Rome, in which is stored now the sculpture known as La Lupa Capitolina. The Uffizi Gallery, Uffizi means offices. It was actually built by Lorenzo as an office, became a gallery gradually, and finally in 1769, it was dedicated to the art of the Italian Renaissance. And it includes The Birth of Venus by Botticelli. The Vatican Museums soon followed in 1771, second most visited museum after the Louvre, located next to the Vatican in Vatican City, or next to Vatican City. And that is where Laocoon and his son's sculpture is found today. So how did the Renaissance arrive in France and museums ultimately with it? Well, the Italian Wars were started in 1494 and continued for 65 years. And the French kings who fought in those wars brought the Italian Renaissance back to France. The first French king was Charles VIII, who lived, and died in Amboise. He brought back Le Bocador, who was a great architect. Bocador means mouth of gold. Apparently, he was a smooth speaker. And his arrival marked the beginning of the Italian influence on French art and architecture. Among other buildings he worked on outside the Loire Valley was the Hôtel de Ville de Paris. He started it, but he did not finish it because it took 100 years to actually complete the construction. After Charles, he was succeeded when he killed himself, actually tragically, hitting his head on a lintel at the Chateau d'Amboise at the tender age of 28. He was succeeded by his second cousin, once removed, Charles VIII, who continued the Italian Wars, and who in turn was succeeded by the very young 21-year-old Francois Ier, first cousin, once removed, and son-in-law of Louis XII. And the first thing he did when he became king in 1550 was to prosecute a war that had actually been initiated or continued by his predecessor at the Battle of Marignan outside Milan in 1515. He brought back to France Leonardo da Vinci to live and create at the Clos Lucé next to his Chateau d'Amboise, Pacello de Mercogliano to design the royal gardens of Amboise and Blois, and Primaticcio and Rosso Fiorentino to decorate Fontainebleau. Leonardo brought with him La Gioconda. Where does the name La Gioconda come from? Well, Lisa was the wife of Francesco del Giocondo. Mona in Italian is like Madame, so Madame Lisa, Mona Lisa, La Gioconde in French, was acquired by Francois Ier, along with other Italian works, upon the death of Leonardo at the Clos Lucé in 1519. And that was the start of the French royal collection. Francois also created with Rosso Fiorentino, Primaticcio, the first school of Fontainebleau, who decorated the magnificent Gallery Francois Ier, the first of the great decorated galleries in French chateau. So the Age of Reason spanned from the 17th to the 19th century, and it was distinguished by independent thinking of individuals, which replaced blind faith in the church and state. In France, the Enlightenment philosophers were Montesquieu, Voltaire, Rousseau, all of whom emphasized the rights of the common man, the third of the three estates in France, as opposed to the exclusive rights of the elite. The first estate and the second estate. First estate were the clergy, the second estate was the nobility. Two other Enlightenment thinkers who had a dramatic impact were Denis Diderot and Jean-Laurent d'Alembert, who co-founded and edited the Encyclopédie, the first encyclopedia, which was intended to capture all human knowledge. They were no longer going on the basis of theology, they were going on the basis of human knowledge, and they attempted to capture it all in 28 volumes, published over 21 years, which included contributions by 150 different experts and represented Enlightenment thinking, the attempt to give the people the knowledge that they needed to improve society, and it was effectively the Bible of the Age of Reason. It was written during the reigns of Louis XV and Louis XVI, whose reign abruptly ended with the Revolution in 1789, which was indeed inspired by the ideas of the Enlightenment. For 3 years, there was a constitutional monarchy with Louis XVI remaining in place. But finally, in 1792, everything was overturned with his arrest, the abolition of the monarchy, the creation of the First Republic, followed quickly soon by the execution of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. As part of the revolution, there was a policy of de-Christianization, whereby all churches were closed and all church property was confiscated. And after the monarchy was abolished, all royal property was confiscated, along with property of the aristocrats in exile. Many churches became temples of reason. Notre Dame was one of them, where the cult of reason replaced Roman Catholicism as the religion of France. And this period is when the first museums of France and Paris were created. The Louvre, the Musée de l'Histoire Naturelle, the Musée des Arts et Métiers, and the Musée des Monuments Français. These were the first museums to open to the public, and they were the true temples of the Age of Reason. The Louvre. This is what it looked like in 1610. At the right, you see the Palais du Louvre, which was originally built by Philippe Auguste in 1200, was adapted to a palace by Charles V around 1380. And then the Palais des Tuileries on the left was built in the 16th century by Catherine de Medici, and Henri IV in 1610 built the Grande Galerie to connect the two. It really didn't change too much. By the time of Louis XIV, the Cour Carrée was created, which was 4 times larger than the palace of Charles V. So yes, that was a big change. Louis extended as well the Palais des Tuileries and used the Grande Galerie to display works by the members of the Royal Academy of Painting and Sculpture that Louis XIV created himself at the instigation of Colbert. The Grande Galerie, it was intended just before the Revolution to dedicate the Grande Galerie to become a permanent display space for the royal painting collection. But the Revolution changed all that, and 1 year exactly to the day after the royal family left the Louvre, it became the Musée Central des Arts, the first museum in Paris, located in the Grande Galerie. During the revolution, Napoleon Bonaparte was General Bonaparte, and he led the Egyptian campaign took 3 years, and he brought with him 167 scientists and scholars called savants in French, known as the Commission des Sciences et des Arts, to Egypt in order to discover the ancient artifacts of Egypt. And as a result of this expedition, the description of Egypt was published over a period of 11 years, 22 volumes, an encyclopedia of Egypt, which inspired a passion for Egyptian art and established Egyptology as an intellectual discipline. One thing they found on that expedition was the Rosetta Stone, discovered in 1799, but captured by British forces in 1801 and brought to the museum. Fortunately, copies were made of the inscriptions in 3 languages on the Rosetta Stone, which were studied by Jean-François Champollion, who deciphered the Egyptian hieroglyphics on the stone starting in 1821. And he actually became the curator of the Louvre's Egyptian collection in 1826. Bonaparte became first consul and then emperor at the tender ages of 30 and 35, respectively. And he continued the process that he'd started in Egypt, which is known as conquête artistique, where his armies would seize artwork from all of the countries that it conquered, including 100 artworks owned by the Pope, in this caricature done by in London in 1815. One of the things seized was indeed the sculpture of Laocoon and his sons. And another thing that was stolen was the wedding feast at Cana from Venice. Also from Venice, the 4 gilded horses that dated back to antique times were removed from the St. Mark's Basilica, transported to Paris and installed on the Arc de Triomphe that Napoleon built between 1807 and 8. And in the Musée Central des Arts was renamed the Musée Napoléon in 1803. It started, as you saw, with the royal collections and artworks of the churches and aristocrats that had been confiscated during the Revolution, added to substantially by the works of art looted from Egypt and continental Europe during the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. And a large part of that increase in the collection was due to the first director of the Musée Napoléon, Dominique Vivant-Denon, who was in fact on the Egyptian expedition himself, became the first director of the museum and expanded the collection dramatically, recording it all in 17 volumes. Waterloo came, the Bourbons were restored, and in the peace treaty negotiated at the Congress of Vienna in 1815, the victors ordered the return of all looted artworks known as spoliation napoléonienne to their countries of origin. It was a haphazard process, but the horses of San Marco were returned in 1850 and placed once again above the front entrance to the basilica, although the original statues are now inside the basilica and copies are on top. And in France, the original horses of St. Mark were replaced by copies, and they still are there today. The Wedding Feast of Cana, on the other hand, is still in the Louvre. Not all, roughly, it's estimated that roughly half of the artwork stolen from Italy was retained by the Louvre. So this is what the Louvre looked like during Napoleon I, the First Empire. He built the Galerie Neuve on the north there, and he resided in the Tuileries Palace on the left. And then the Musée Napoléon was still in the Grande Galerie on the right. And the Louvre has evolved a lot from that. I would say there's roughly 10 times more exhibition space. It's now the most visited museum in the world, and it's got the most gallery space of any museum in the world. The numbers are staggering when talking about the Louvre. And if you want to hear more about it, please come next week to Françoise Mardrousse's talk about the making of the Louvre Museum. There were other museums created during the Revolution, 3 others. The Muséum National d'Histoire Naturelle, located next to the Jardin des Plantes on the left bank, started out as the Royal Medicinal Herb Garden and the Cabinet du Roi, the Cabinet of Curiosities of Louis XIII in 1636. And you can see it was quite small then. Georges Louis Leclerc, the Comte de Buffon, was by far the most influential director in the history of the Jardin des Plantes. He was there for nearly 50 years and transformed the cabinet into the leading institution of scientific research in Europe. He was a great naturalist and in his own right, writing the 36 volumes of the Histoire Naturelle. He doubled the size of the garden and enlarged the Cabinet d'Histoire Naturelle, just dying at age 80, the year before the Revolution. During the Revolution, the Jardin du Roi was confiscated and renamed the Jardin des Plantes, the Botanical Garden. And of course, the Cabinet du Roi was also, like all other royal property, confiscated and renamed the Musée d'Histoire Naturelle. And this is the seal that was created for the museum. It's called a museum and not a musée, not sure why. The Cabinet d'Histoire Naturelle was reorganized into 4 separate thematic galleries in 4 different buildings in the 19th and early 20th century. And there on the left, you have the principal one where the original cabinet was located. And along the left side of the garden, the south side of the garden, east side, pardon me, of the garden, you have the other 3 galleries. The first one built was a gallery of mineralogy and geology, right there. The next one was a gallery, the zoology, which replaced the former Cabinet d'Histoire that was built in 1877 to 79. Then the Gallery of Paleontology and Comparative Anatomy, and finally the Gallery of Botany. But the pièce de résistance was a renovation of the Galerie de Zoologie, which started in 1981 and was finally finished in 1994, where the Galerie de Zoologie was renamed the Grande Galerie de l'Évolution and is not to be missed. Third museum created during the Revolution, the Musée des Arts et Métiers, the Museum of Arts and Trades, which I think is better translated as science and technology, because it was founded originally as a repository for scientific instruments, and it's one of the it's one of the oldest technical and industrial museums in the world, housed in the deserted Priory of St. Martin's in the Fields. Once upon a time in the Middle Ages, Paris, which is surrounded here by the Philippe Auguste Wall of 1200, was surrounded by, outside the city, different monasteries, and St. Martin of the Fields was one of them, located here in Paris today. It started as a priory of the Cluniac congregation in the 11th century. And as you can see, it got quickly surrounded by a city the city moved out from Philippe Auguste Wall, and it remained intact through the Revolution, 1739, and it's still and beyond. And it now is the home of the Conservatoire National des Arts et Métiers, of which the museum is a part. And it shows the location at the bottom here of the CNIM along the Rue Saint-Martin. This is the longest side of it. It has the same footprint as the former priory, and it's the only monastery from the old days in Paris that's retained more or less the look and feel of the original monastery, or in this case called a priory. It has a vast collection of objects of all types. I'm just going to go through them quick, just some of the amazing things that are in there. I love the daguerreotype created by this man himself. Foucault's pendulum is in there, not the original. A plaster model of the Statue of Liberty and two of the very earliest airplanes. The final museum, fourth museum created during the Revolution, was the Musée des Monuments Français, created by Alexandre Lenoir in the former chapel of the Couvent des Petits Augustins, convent of the little Augustin monks. And he transformed that chapel into the Musée des Monuments Français to preserve works confiscated and damaged during the Revolution. These could come from churches, they could come from palaces or a chateau in the country. Most of the works were restored to the original owners during the restorations. Therefore, the museum closed in 1860, and the building was transferred to the École des Beaux-Arts, which was built on that site between 1832 and 1872. And there's the courtyard with an arrow pointing to the convent or the chapel, just off couple of blocks on the left bank off the Seine. While Alexandre Lenoir's Musée des Monuments Français was closed, a new one opened in 1879, established by Viollet-le-Duc, dedicated to the history of architecture and heritage. It was first located in this spectacular building, the Palais de Trocadero, built for the Universal Exposition of 1878, which was replaced by the Palais de Chaillot, and the Cité de l'Architecture et du Patrimoine moved there in 2007 and houses collections of the Musée des Monuments Français, as well as the Institut Français de l'Architecture and the École de Chaillot, which is a architecture school for restoration architecture, the only one in France. 13 museums were created in the 19th century. We'll talk about, there will be presentations about Versailles, Cluny, Carnavalet, Art Décoratif, and Condé. And I will briefly touch upon some of the others. The Cimetière des Innocents, which was the largest cemetery in France, opened in the 12th century, closed just before the Revolution. Bones were removed just before the Revolution. In its place, a market was created around the famous Fontaine des Innocents, which is still there next to Les Halles. And the bones that were removed from the Cimetière des Innocents were transferred to an abandoned quarry in the south of Paris. And it was redubbed the Paris Municipal Ossuary, and it opened to the public by appointment in 1809. It's attached to, I think, the Musée Carnavalet, so it is actually considered a museum and by the city of Paris. It's owned by the city of Paris. And to get there, you have to go 20 meters below the surface and walk along a one-way corridor that leads 1 mile underground through bones and skulls. It's quite remarkable. If you're claustrophobic, I do not recommend it. But the entrance is a new entrance that was built just on the Place d'Enfer Rochereau. So moving into the 18th, 19th century, the Palais de Luxembourg, built by Marie de Médicis after Henri IV was assassinated. And it remained in the royal family. And then from 1750, and she actually, commissioned the Medici cycle of paintings by Rubens about her life and times, which were displayed in the east-west wing of the Palais de Luxembourg. They were called the Galerie du Palais de Luxembourg between 1750 and 1780, along with some other old master collections. Fantastic, gigantic paintings by Rubens, which were then moved to the Louvre in 1817, and then finally to the new Richelieu wing in around 1990. During the Revolution, the Palais de Luxembourg was used first as a prison, briefly, then as the seat of the Directory, and then off and on it has been the seat of the Senate. But the galleries remained open for some time, dedicated, however, to living artists now. And the idea was that the living artists would display their arts, and after their death, certain of their arts, selected arts, would be transferred to the Louvre, to the permanent collection of the Louvre, making it arguably the first contemporary art museum. The Senate requisitioned the entire palace in 1879 and moved the museum to the former orangerie of the palace, where it stands today. But the museum that I just described, of living artists, closed in 1937. And now, since 1979, this space is used exclusively for temporary exhibitions. The history museums of the 19th century, starting with Versailles, 20 kilometers, 60 miles west of Paris, southwest of Paris, was built by Louis XIV. He started when he was 23 and finished when he was about to die, when he was 75, I believe. And the spectacular palace was built by architects during the Louis XIV era. Lavaux, Lebrun decorated it. Ardouin, Monsart added to it, including the creation of the spectacular Galerie des Glaces, roughly 100 years after Rosso di Fiorentino created the first great gallery, François Ier at Fontainebleau. And of course, André Le Nôtre built the spectacular garden, modified subsequently by Jules, or added to by Jules Ardouin Monsart. The last project that Louis XIV worked on was the construction of the Royal Chapel. He was succeeded by his great-grandson, Louis XV, who built the Petit Trianon and the Royal Opera, who was succeeded by his son, Louis XVI, whose wife, Marie Antoinette, built the Hameau de la Reine. Revolution occurred, Versailles was confiscated, and its furniture was all sold. Everything that could be moved was sold. It was empty. Napoleon lived in the Tuileries, and he went to Fontainebleau, not Versailles. Louis XVIII and Charles VIII resided in the Tuileries, not in Versailles. So it fell to Louis Philippe, the king of the French and constitutional July monarchy, to revive Versailles. And he did it by transforming it into a museum of French history, which was inaugurated in 1837 and features the Galerie des Batailles on the first floor of the south wing. A huge gallery, the largest gallery in the chateau, larger than the Galerie des Glaces, with 33 large format paintings of battles from Clovis to Napoleon. But it didn't remain just a museum of French history. It was transformed to a museum of the royal residence. And if you want to learn all about that exciting transformation, tune in on January 25th for a lecture I will be giving. Cluny, Musée du Moyen Âge, is located, all of these museums are located in phenomenal buildings in their own right. In the Hôtel des Abbés de Cluny, remember we were talking about Saint-Martin-des-Champs, where the Musée des Arts et Métiers is located? Well, that priory was overseen by the abbots of Cluny. And when they came to Paris, they resided in the Hôtel des Abbés de Cluny here. It was confiscated during the Revolution, as were the baths, Roman baths immediately adjacent to it. And it was privately owned. It was sold, believe it or not, by the revolutionary government. And part of it was rented by Alexandre Sommerard, who used his part of the museum to store his collection of medieval and Renaissance objects. The state of France, it wasn't a state, it was a monarchy at that point. It was Louis Philippe bought the hotel and Sommerard's collection in 1842 and opened the Museum of the Thermal Baths and the Hôtel de Cluny in 1844, which changed its name to the Musée de Cluny, Musée National du Moyen Âge in 1992, and features the oldest monument in Paris, the Pilier des Notes, discovered in the excavation of the Parvis in front of Notre Dame, and the Lady and the Unicorn, 6 tapestries acquired by Cluny in 1882. A spectacular renovation took place in the past 10 years, and you will hear all about, and it's located here on the left bank, right off the Boulevard Saint-Michel and the Boulevard Saint-Germain. And please come on February 1st to hear Séverine Lepape tell you the story of the Musée de Cluny. Musée de Carnavalet was the brainchild of the prefect of the Seine, Georges-Eugène Haussmann, who was responsible for totally modernizing Paris and demolishing so much of the old Paris. But interestingly, he had the idea to preserve a lot of Paris's history. And in order to accommodate this museum, he initiated the purchase of the Hôtel Carnavalet. While that was all going on, he was storing a collection to be stored, to go to the museum in the Hôtel de Ville. Musée de Carnavalet, one of the first and most magnificent hôtel particulier built in the Marais, featuring the famous sequence of Cour, Logis, Jardin, the courtyard, the residence, and the garden. This is Madame de Sévigné lived in the Hôtel de Carnavalet, and it's there that she wrote most of her thousands of letters to her daughter, describing life at the court of Louis XIV. As I mentioned, the Hôtel de Ville, which was started by our friend Bocador back in 1533, but was much enlarged, dramatically enlarged in the 19th century by Louis Philippe, and then continued by Haussmann. It was used to store the city archives, but also the collection that was supposed to go to the Musée Carnavalet, but it all went up in smoke. While the Hôtel de Ville was rebuilt, as it was before it was burned down, the collection did not survive. Therefore, it had to be rebuilt. And it's a gigantic collection today, too. Mainly residential, but you can walk through the ages of Paris at the Carnavalet. If you want to hear how, and it's located in the center of the Marais, just off the main street, the Rue des Francs-Bourgeois. If you want to hear how that collection was recreated after the terrible fire, please attend Ulysse Yarda's lecture on February 8th. Then there were the museums of the private collectors. Émile Etienne Guimet, an industrialist from Lyon, traveled the world collecting, particularly Asian art, and founded the Musée Guimet on the Place d'Iéna in the 16th arrondissement in 1889. It's now the largest collection of Asian art outside Asia. Henri Cernucci came to France from Italy, traveled to Japan and China in 1871 to 73 and acquired 5,000 works of art. He built a Hotel Particulier on the Avenue Velasquez next to the Parc Monceau and bequeathed his hotel and collection to the city of Paris. It's the second largest art collection in Paris after the Musée Guimet. And Henri d'Orléans, Duc d'Aumale, was the ultimate collector. He was the fifth of five sons, fourth of five sons of Louis Philippe, who were there at the inauguration of the Histoire de France, but he had to go into exile when Louis Philippe was overthrown in 1848, and he spent his time in exile collecting. He was the wealthiest man in France, and he created the most extravagant collection in France. He returned to France to create the Musée Condé, or his collection, to store his collection, the musée at the Château de Chantilly, 30 miles northeast of Paris. The chateau originally consisted, there were two chateaux, both of them built in the 16th century, the Grand Chateau and the Petit Chateau. The Grand Chateau was destroyed during the Revolution and was rebuilt by the Duc d'Aumale to store his collection. It's located in a gigantic park that was laid out by Le Nôtre, and it features a wonderful collection. Art, in particular, the Cabinet des Clouets, which is 150 portraits of the French court and nobility, the French court, including this wonderful portrait of Francois Ier. The Cabinet des Livres, the library, the bibliothèque, the highlight of which is a copy of the illuminated prayer book Les Très Riches Heures du Duc de Berry, with 66 large illustrations, spectacular illustrations showing, for example, on the left there, the Ile de la Cité seen from the west, looking at the Louvre, the Palais de la Cité, and that's, I guess that, and that on the right of that is the Sainte-Chapelle. It also, the museum features not only art, but also the great apartments. Please come on February 15th to hear Mathieu Deldic tell the story. The Industrial Revolution came along and brought capitalism and the creation of the first museums, the first commercial museums. Madame Tussauds was founded in England by the French woman Marie Tussaud with wax figures, and she was emulated 50 years later in 1882 when the Musée Grévin Museum opened. It is now the most popular private museum in Paris. It's located next to the Passage Geoffroy on the Grand Boulevard. And then there were the Exposition Universelle, started once again by the English, who after Waterloo were always ahead of Paris in the latest things. And one of them was the Industrial Revolution, another was the Exposition Universelle, or World's Fairs, which in turn inspired the creation of the first museums of applied arts. The first great exhibition, first universal exhibition, was at the Crystal Palace in 1851 in Hyde Park. Magnificent building, which was ultimately relocated to South London in 1854 and burned to the ground in 1936. But it inspired the creation of the Victoria and Albert Museum as a museum, first called a museum of manufacturers. It's the world's largest museum of applied arts, decorative arts, and design. So France copied Paris, and they, Napoleon III, having been in England during his exile, wanted to have his own exhibitions, and he had two during the Second Empire, and there were 5 more that followed. The first was held in 1855. The Palais de l'Industrie et des Beaux-Arts was located on the Champs-Élysées, and it included the Galerie des Machines. Again, it was to show industrial design, technology, inventions. Followed by the fair in 1867. This one took place on the Champ de Mars, and this huge palais was built there. Also including a lot of new inventions and machinery. Followed by another exhibition in 1871. This one that went from the left, the Champ de Mars, to the right on the right bank of the Seine at the Place de Trocadero. The centerpiece was the Palais de l'Industrie, where Thomas Edison displayed his phonograph and won a grand prize, and as did Alexander Graham Bell for his telephone. The head of the Statue of Liberty was displayed at this exhibition, which ultimately ended up on the rest of the statue in 1886 in New York Harbor. The Palais de Trocadero, as I showed you, was at the east far side, opposite the Palais de l'Industrie. And it was replaced ultimately by the Palais de Chaillot for the Exposition Universelle of 1937. And the Cité de l'Architecture du Patrimoine that I mentioned a while ago is located on the right wing, and the Musée de la Marine and Musée de l'Homme are located in the left wing. There are no buildings left from the first 3 exhibitions, but there are these magnificent statues that were removed from the Palais de Trocadero and placed in front of the entrance to the Musée d'Orsay, the 6 continents, and these wonderful animal statues. And the Musée, these first 3 exhibitions inspired the founding of the Musée des Arts Décoratifs by a group of collectors to promote the applied arts as opposed to the fine arts, and to develop links with industry and commerce and culture, design, and production, with the mission to keep alive the culture of the arts in France, which seek to make useful things beautiful. Located in the Marsan Pavilion at the left and wing in the center of the Louvre since 1905. It's got collections of all sorts of exotic, very wonderful collection, various items, decorative arts, jewels, fashion, advertising, toys, and a wonderful library. If you want to hear more about it, please tune in on February 22nd for the presentation by Sophie Much. And with that, I will sign off and we will move to Q&A. Thank you very much.
Russell, thank you so much for this overlook of what all the good things that are coming up in the next few weeks. I just wonder if the public has any question about this presentation that I see a lot of thank yous there. We have about, we had 100, about close to 100 people present. And we're really looking forward to digging in all those museum visits, starting with the Louvre next week. While people pick up the question, and I need to look in the two different boxes, the Q&A as well. Okay, I'm keeping an eye on this. A question I heard from some of the people here at the Alliance Française de Chicago is, so I know a lot of people listening have been to Paris many times, but there's also people who have not gone to Paris yet. So my question will be twofold. If you are a connoisseur of Paris, which museum would you recommend the most? Maybe an unsung gem or something that people really don't think about at first, even if they've visited all the main museum.
Well, a museum that I particularly like, if you're talking about literally the city of Paris, we will hear from Ulysse Jardin about the Museum of the City of Paris, Carnavalet. And that's great because it kind of gives you a thematic and chronological tour through the various ages of Paris. But one that I think is even better to get a start on Paris is called the Pavillon de l'Arsenal, which is located just off the Boulevard Henri IV in the 4th arrondissement. And it's quite small, but it shows you the city. Literally, it has a maquette, a model of the city of Paris. And it shows you how it literally evolved over the years. And, the city of Paris started out on an island, and then there were 7 different walls that saw it expand. And they do an extremely good job of explaining how it's more a museum of city planning, is I guess how they would call it, but it's not just current city planning. It reflects the city planning that's gone on in Paris over centuries. So I'm a big fan of the Pavillon de l'Arsenal.
Well, it's funny that you've mentioned Carnavalet at first, because Shama Patel on the chat line did mention it too. So I think that's a popular one. I know I've been there. I got lost in there. It's such a big museum. And I was there, of course, to see the reproduction of the room of Marcel Proust, which is one of the highlights of that museum. Another mention from Rob Strauss is the Musée Zadkine, which I've never heard about. So that's interesting. And as to the Pavillon de l'Arsenal, it's such a coincidence because we welcomed the new director of le Pavillon de l'Arsenal, le Musée de l'Architecture et d'Urbanisme de Paris. Her name is Marion Waller. She also published a book. She is actually a philosopher and urbanist, and she was one of the best presentations we had this fall. So I'll make sure to send you the recording. She was amazing. And she was talking about all the changes happening in Paris, like the city of Paris wanting to bring back the trees, and what happened if you bring back the trees in a city? Well, you bring back the animals, and who's got the right of way? Is it the animals? Is it the pedestrian? Is it the cars? So a really philosophical take on the future of Paris. She was really fascinating. So that's the connoisseur. Now, if it's your first time in Paris, let's say someone's listening to us, never been to Paris, is it Le Louvre? Is it La Joconde? Is that what you have to do?
Well, the 3 museums that kind of, you can't miss the Louvre. I mean, the Louvre, you've got to start there. It is, however, overwhelming. Therefore, you have to be somewhat selective about when you visit the Louvre. So, I personally have my selection of 3 or 4 places that I like to go. Yes, you can walk up to the La Joconde. You know what it looks like, and you will get a pretty good idea of whether the room is full, and you'll never get anywhere near it without waiting for half an hour. Personally, I would skip it and go further down the Grande Galerie. And they've got these spectacular paintings from the Romantic era of France that we all know and love, plus the great Italian paintings. So I think the first thing to see, frankly, is the Grande Galerie. That's what I would do. Then we all have our little favorite places. In the Louvre, my three favorite places are number one, the foundations of the original Chateau du Louvre, the fortress of the Louvre, which were uncovered during the excavations of the Cour Carrée in the 1990s, as late as that. So they literally didn't know that they had these foundations there. So you can actually go down and see the foundations of the chateau, the fortress that was built there in 1200. You can see the Napoleon 3 rooms, which have perfectly preserved, so you get a really good idea of what they look like. I was talking earlier about galleries, the great galleries. I mentioned the Galerie des Glaces, the Hall of Mirrors. Well, there's the Galerie d'Apollon, the Gallery of Apollo, that was built by the very same Lebrun, or decorated by the very same Lebrun before he did the Galerie des Glaces. That's in the Louvre, and you should definitely see that. So those are three of my favorite spots.
Well, that's really helpful because I know how big it is. And there's also, it's good to have a plan because if you just wander around, you get overwhelmed and sometimes it's not as effective a visit. But the Louvre is a place where you can go back again and again and again. I do have an interesting question here from someone who's an academist, excuse me, an economist, who says, I'm interested in the cost of the early Louvre and other early great museums. They must have cost a very large share of the national GDP. How did people react to spending so much on art? So, Russell, you're not an economist, but maybe you have insight or can.
Well, if we start with the first museums, I mean, it evolved over time. There some museums like the Guimet, or not Guimet, Grévin, that I talk about, that they're for-profit museums. Most of these museums are not for profit; they're nonprofits. They survive through. In the early days, it was a political statement. The first museums that I mentioned, three of the first museums I mentioned, were all owned by royalty or the church.
Hmm.
And those were the first two estates, or the other way around, the church and royalty and monarchs and aristocracy were the first two estates. The third estate took over all of their property and they made it open to the public. So I'm sure there was some cost involved in opening up the Louvre and running it, but it was seen as indeed part of the whole point of the revolution, is to make available to the people this art that had been preserved for the first two estates. Over time, I don't really know how things were financed in the 19th century. I'm pretty familiar with how they're financed now. And I suppose from the get-go, national museums were funded by the state. And France has a long tradition of supporting culture. And it's quite different from the United States, for example, where our culture is supported by the local community. You know, the Art History Museum in Chicago was created by the great Chicagoans who wanted to have a museum. Field Museum, same thing. Mr. Field created the museum. The symphony was supported by private individuals. It wasn't supported by the city, the state, or much less the country. In France, they've got a long tradition of centralized power, which meant that there was a lot more government support and the people support, and the people accepted that. As a result, there's relatively little private philanthropy in Europe, which is why so many of the French museums now have American Friends organizations.
As we saw, as
Indeed.
part of our partners. Okay, one quick last question, because I know people probably want to go for lunch now. The golden age, as you presented so well, of the museum was the 19th century. Was there another more recent golden age of Paris Museum? I have something in mind, but I want to hear it from you.
Yeah. Well, yes. So the first golden age, which is more or less the topic of this, actually carried through until World War I. I mean, I start, just to limit it, I arbitrarily stopped at 1900 essentially, but I could have gone through to World War One, and there are a lot of more great museums actually created in the first 14 years of the 20th century. But between the World War One and Two and everything in between, things were fairly chaotic. So there were no museums of substance created during that period. I can't think of any. And then there was a huge rebuilding effort, particularly for housing. That was the emphasis after World War II. But the new era of museum build, the second golden age, started 50 years ago with the beginning of the, it used to be royal museums, and then it became presidential museums. And Pompidou had his first presidential museum in 1770. He died in 72 or 3. The museum was opened in his honor in 1977, followed by Giscard d'Estaing's museum, which was the Musée d'Orsay, which is scheduled to be demolished. And thank God he stopped the destruction of the railroad station and converted and built the Musée d'Orsay, which opened in 1986, I believe. And then the great museum builder François Mitterrand came along, and he built another slew of museums. And Chirac has the Musée d'Orsay, not to mention the Musée Quai Branly, not to mention the private museums that have been created in that period, such as the Cartier, the Fondation Cartier, the Fondation Pinault, the Fondation Louis Vuitton, ainsi de suite. So there's been it's staggering to me to see that even today, with all 136 museums in Paris, they're still creating new museums.
I know the most recent one being the Bourse du Commerce. I don't remember who is behind that, but another new museum. And we won't even talk about the museum exporting their brand to other countries. Maybe we can save that for next time. But Russell, thank you so much. I'm now going to give it back to Mary-Ellen Connellan, the Executive Director of the Alliance Française de Chicago. À vous, Marie.
Okay. Merci beaucoup, Aimé. And what can I say? Merci infiniment to you, Russell. Do we see Russell still? He seems to have disappeared. There you are, there you are. In any case, merci infiniment for what was absolutely an astonishing presentation. And of course, we are not surprised. It has whetted our appetite for what is to come in the future weeks. Merci infiniment. I want to thank all of our partners for their support as well. And thanks to everyone who participated with us today. So now, à la prochaine, we hope to see you next week, Thursday, January the 18th at 12 p.m. Chicago time, 1 o'clock Miami time, Eastern time, and at 7 o'clock in the evening in Paris, when we visit one of the best known museums. We talked about it today, museums, I should say, in the world, Le Louvre. And this will be in the company of Françoise Madrus, who is the Director of Museum Studies and Research. So to all of you, à la prochaine.